In 1968, a small library in Boston, Massachusetts began receiving mysterious books with no barcodes, no signs of publication, and in an unfamiliar language. One after another, these illegible and untraceable books appeared in the library's Bookdrop. This seemingly innocuous event might have gone unnoticed, if not for the discovery of the young librarian found dead and disfigured months later. I've discovered something inside an abandoned apartment. According to my friend, whose landlord owns the garage the apartment sits on, the previous tenant left without paying rent, leaving a lot behind. Most notably, the boxes. And not the moving kind. This was someone's archive. The contents describe countless unexplained, strange, and disturbing events, some spanning back centuries. Without a trace of involvement from law enforcement, all of this appears to be the work of a private investigator. And most of it refers to actual documentation, carefully preserved. Why would someone leave all of this behind? Is it all an elaborate hoax? Regardless, I think it's worth sharing. So that's what this channel is. Sit back and take a look for yourself as I tell you about a case file I like to call the tome in the Bookdrop. Your community library. Towering aisles, hushed voices, volumes upon volumes of thoughts, theories, and stories. Even if you tried, you could never read all of it. Roamed by the sentinels of knowledge, the bookkeepers, the librarians. The events in the file take place in one such library between 1967 and 1969, somewhere near Boston, where a young librarian named Madeline Connolly receives a series of strange books in the library's Bookdrop. According to the case file, not only do the books not belong to the library, they don't possess a call number, book pocket, or any other sign of where or to whom they belong. These books aren't ancient, possibly only 30 or 40 years old, but they're not in English. In fact, they're not in any language Madeline recognizes at all. This was a time of turmoil for the country. An unpopular televised war, a series of political assassinations, new ideas and lifestyles threatening the status quo. It's no wonder so little attention was paid to a bizarre death like Madeline's. According to the investigator's notes, Madeline Connolly was a bright 22-year-old college student studying to become a teacher. This was a time of discovery, curiosity, and self-empowerment. She'd been working at the library for 3 years, and her boyfriend of 2 years, Charlie Higgins, was a frequent visitor. The young couple had recently moved in together, but unfortunately, their relationship would end in tragedy. On October 14th, 1968, Madeline's body was found. The police report describes the scene as follows. Madeline's apartment was seemingly turned into some type of diorama, made up of furniture arranged into a tree-like formation, with charred doves hanging from the ceiling. It only gets more disturbing from there.
Victim found at approximate room midpoint. Victim's torso and upper extremities upheld vertically by means of cordage, secured beneath the auxiliary regions, affixed to the surrounding architectural structures at multiple points.
Her body was held in an upright, kneeling position below the strange furniture structure, suspended by rope attached to the walls and ceiling. While her torso was faced away, her arms and head had been
contorted and retroflexed. Victim's hands conjoined and elevated in posture reminiscent of a prayer.
meaning her neck and shoulders were bent and broken backwards. With her hands bound together, Madeline's body was left in what could only be described as a horrifying, inverted position of prayer. And punctuating it all, her mouth was left hanging open, filled and overflowing with pomegranate seeds. This gruesome tableau clearly seems to be a deliberate, symbolic display raising questions about the prayer pose, the tree, the burnt doves. What is all of this suggesting? The entire scene was horrific. Her body and the arrangement of the room was clearly purposeful. Another important detail to the crime scene: a vial of LSD belonging to Madeline's boyfriend, Charlie Higgins. Charlie was subsequently taken into custody. The police considered this an acid-induced mania attack, a straightforward case of domestic homicide between two lovers, but I have my doubts. LSD was a new and scary thing at the time, and it was quickly developing a less than sunny reputation, particularly among authorities. Today, we know this narrative may have been overblown, but even if LSD somehow caused Charlie to become homicidal, does it really make sense that one bad trip could cause him to execute such an elaborate and methodical scene as this? In the last months of 1968, Charlie awaited trial, pleading innocence. The only evidence against him, a half-empty vial of LSD with his fingerprints, found in his home where love once bloomed, now condemning his fate. Charlie was portrayed as a deranged, occultist hippie, a murderous freak, a stain and punishment he would live with for the rest of his life. The case file includes several official, heavily redacted documents from the homicide investigation by local authorities. But in addition to the official police report, our best insight into the disturbing events come from a series of documents created by an independent private investigator, including 2 transcribed interviews conducted with Madeline's boss, the head librarian, Miss Sylvia Burke. As far as I can tell, there's no indication that the investigator's work was sanctioned by or affiliated with the official police investigation or any other government agency. Who this investigator is and who, if anyone, they worked for remains unknown. These transcripts are the only recorded conversations in the case file, and the light they would shed on the discrepancies of the official investigation would prove to be substantial. Early on in the interview, the investigator asks what Sylvia knew about Madeline's faith.
Can you speak at all to her religious views? I do know she had strong feelings against the church. Madeline had been homeschooled. Religion was very important to her family growing up. She renounced her faith a few years ago.
Considering the religious iconography of the crime scene, this seems like a crucial detail, but Sylvia questions the relevance.
Are you sure there was nothing else in particular matter she shared? Nothing I can think of, no. Is this relevant to your investigation? You're aware of the manner Miss Connolly's body was found in her apartment? I read a bit about it in the papers, yes. Unimaginable. I'm afraid I couldn't bring myself to read very much. We have reason to believe that her murder was ritualistic in nature. Ritualistic? Yes, ma'am. I don't know what to make of that.
Sylvia seems understandably shaken when the investigator describes the murder as ritualistic. It might just be me, but something about this topic seems to be making Sylvia uncomfortable. It's when the investigator presses on that we get our first recorded mention of the books. The moment is quick and casual, seemingly interrupted by an unknown third party offering coffee.
Books? Can you elaborate on those? Part of Madeline's job was collecting and sorting the books from the Bookdrops throughout the day. Occasionally, we will receive books in our Bookdrop from other libraries. And other times, people will just donate books. It's common and not entirely unusual. Starting in the fall of 1967, I don't know the exact date, we started receiving a series of unmarked books in our Bookdrop. So, they were not from the library. They were not, no. But they made an impression of some kind on Miss Connolly. Yes.
Madeline took a strong interest in the books. Even though Sylvia downplayed her interest in linguistics as a casual hobby, she seems to immediately recognize the language. She tells the investigator it's Germanic, albeit
Certainly more primitive, some sort of runic alphabet.
she identified it as Proto Norse. Madeline was determined to learn more about the books, so Sylvia offers to bring them to someone who might know more.
Were you or Miss Connolly able to discern anything about their contents? Well, that's what Madeline wanted to know. So I tell her I have a friend, quite an established antiquarian book dealer. Very knowledgeable. I pass them along on Madeline's behalf.
It was indeed Proto-Norse, and strangely appeared to be less than 50 years old. The appraiser even offered to review them overnight. However, Sylvia describes how he suddenly changed his mind, calling her late that night, demanding she take them back. Sylvia claims he was distressed and superstitious, a foreboding sign of unsettling events to come.
He was Serbian, a very superstitious man. Did Miss Burke know about this conversation with him? She did. It didn't dissuade her interest. Quite the opposite.
The bizarre reaction only seemed to embolden Madeline's interest in the books. Madeline pressed on, adamant to continue deciphering the mystery of the books and its contents. Sylvia insists she only helped a little, claiming the task was too tedious and she merely pointed her in the right direction. Later on in the interview, Sylvia describes how Madeline's growing interest with the books took a paranoid turn.
Miss Burke, during this time, was Miss Connolly showing any signs of distress that stood out to you? Very much so. Please describe. I wasn't exactly sure how to put it at first. It all seemed to begin the day the deer died.
The day the deer died. The first thing that stands out here is the investigator's seemingly abrupt question. Nothing prior to this in the interview would give him reason to ask about signs of distress. Then there's the nature of Sylvia's reply, the day the deer died.
Madeline had been particularly animated that day. She came to work practically overflowing about some sort of discovery she'd made the night before and wanted to show me.
Sylvia says whatever exciting discovery Madeline had made, She never learned what it was because of the disturbing accident that followed.
It was a tragic accident, entirely unusual. A large buck. Somehow the poor thing had managed to confuse itself and accidentally injured a man just outside the library. Ran its antlers straight into him as I was leaving.
Sylvia seems to take great sympathy for the deer, particularly in describing its painful demise as it crashed through the front doors where it slowly bled out on the broken glass.
It was thrashing about and there was so much blood already. You can understand neither of us were equipped for that sort of thing, of course. Madeline stayed with the poor thing to the end.
When Sylvia states that it took an unusually long time for authorities to arrive, the investigator hits upon a staggering coincidence.
Do you have any idea what caused the delay? Sorry? You said Madeline stayed with the deer to the end. I presume you mean to say the authorities didn't arrive for quite some time. Well, I suppose I assumed it must have had something to do with the fires.
The fires. The description of the fires, presumably the location, has been redacted. One of the few redactions in these transcriptions. What was it about the nature of the fires the investigator felt the need to hide? And what could something like that have to do with the investigation? The dialogue that follows may provide a clue, yet opens still more questions.
Do you have any thoughts on what this incident meant to Madeline? I believe she felt responsible. She felt responsible for the fires? What? No, for what happened to the deer. In what regard? That part was never clear to me, unfortunately.
How could Madeline feel responsible for such random events? And what, if anything, could this have to do with the books? From there, things only get more strange. Sylvia shares another anecdote where Madeline says she felt as if someone or something was following her.
Madeline was at the front desk, and I was in my office. I remember a loud crash. When I came out into the library, I found Madeline standing frozen near a pile of books scattered on the ground. She was staring down one of the aisles. I looked, but saw nothing unusual. I asked her what happened, and all she said was, "There it is." But it was completely empty. Not just the aisle, but the entire library. "Something stalks me," is what she told me. I can feel it.
What did Madeline see in the empty aisles that day? Could this just be a hallucination related to Charlie's supply of LSD? Or could it be somehow related to the Proto-Norse texts she was translating? If it was related to the books, if she was truly seeing something following her, could this thing have somehow been responsible for her death? Sylvia deflects attention away from Madeline, suggesting her behavior may have had something to do with the problems in her relationship with Charlie.
Is that what you told the police? I never talked to the police. They were pretty confident it was Charlie. Do you believe Charlie was responsible for her death? It really isn't my place to say, but with these things, how they go, who else could it be? What do you know about the murder? Oh, just horrible to imagine her like that. Her body broken and those pomegranates in her. I'm sorry.
Her response includes a very specific detail about the crime scene that, unbeknownst to Sylvia, isn't public knowledge. Oops. According to the investigator's post-interview assessment, the pomegranates mentioned in Madeline's mouth was never shared with the public. There is something more to this after all. Despite this revelation, the investigator smoothly continues. His final line of questioning is regarding the book's whereabouts.
Before I let you go, do you happen to have any idea where these books are now? I'm sorry, the books? I assume the police must have had them, or I suppose Madeline had them last, but I haven't seen them since it happened. If they happen to turn up, I'll be sure to let you know.
While this interview concludes here, the investigator remains suspicious. His post-interview assessment notes several standout moments. The pomegranates, Sylvia downplaying her interest in the books, and finally, the possibility that Sylvia's emotional state may not be rooted in pity for Madeline's tragic demise, but rather in regret. The assessment concludes by calling for a follow-up interview with Miss Sylvia Burke. This time, with a singular focus in mind: the books. The investigator immediately seeks clarification on
the nature of the books and your familiarity with its contents. But you recognize the language. Proto-Norse isn't especially hard to identify. The runic alphabet alone. You described your interest in linguistics as casual, but in addition to identifying the language, you assisted Miss Connolly in the book's translation.
Sylvia is now clearly on the defensive, feigning ignorance. However, the investigator persists.
Am I being accused of something? That depends entirely on you and your honesty with us moving forward. In that spirit, if I can be honest with you for a moment, I find it hard to believe you'd share so little interest in the books while continuing to provide Miss Connolly with everything she'd need to explore them on her own without your involvement.
Sylvia has found herself cornered. For someone who is able to identify an obscure language like Proto-Norse, it's doubtful she would be so disinterested in the books. She pushes back, questioning the investigator's intentions, going so far as to cast doubt on whether the investigator is even who he says he is.
Miss Burke, my colleagues and I believe you may have quite a good notion as to the reason for our interest. Are you referring to your colleagues at? You should know I'm beginning to doubt whether you've been wholly forthcoming in that regard. I'd be happy to show you my credentials again. I'm sure.
Let's pause here a moment. In both interviews, the investigator repeatedly alludes to a group or agency he's affiliated with. Yet, all references are redacted, even in his reports. Whoever he claimed to represent, Sylvia Burke seemed to recognize and initially trust it, a trust which was now beginning to fray. Was it a government agency or something else? The true origin of these case files might lie with this unknown organization. Whatever it may be, the investigator's report formatting makes it clear he was not working alone. The investigator continues pressing Miss Burke, claiming,
We also know about your presence at the crime scene. I don't understand. Perhaps, but we do know beyond any doubt that your knowledge of the crime scene extends beyond what was made available to the public. What knowledge was that? You mentioned the pomegranates. The pomegranates, yes. Well, yes, I read about them in the newspaper. It's dreadful. I can assure you there is no mention of pomegranates anywhere in the public record.
unintelligible.
Miss Burke, what do you want with me? Honesty.
Sylvia seems to panic when the investigator asks her what's wrong. Sylvia points out that Madeline's boyfriend, Charlie, is already in prison, so what could the investigator be getting at with these accusations? But this is when the investigator's true motives are finally revealed.
I don't understand. They've already locked away that boy, her boyfriend Charlie. He's going to be convicted. That is not our primary concern. Then what is? Who are you? You're not... Please tell me what you want. Unfortunately, there are several relevant parties that will be quite interested to know what we've learned here, and we do have an obligation to disclose it.
Sylvia is out of options. She relents, and the investigator goes in for the kill.
All right, I'll tell you, just please don't. You admit you were involved in Miss Connolly's effort to translate the books. Yes, the two of you made discoveries that troubled you. Yes, you began to fear the consequences. Yes.
It's all about the books. It's always been about the books. And then the investigator brings it home.
Something had to be done about it. Yes.
Is this Sylvia Burke's confession? To what exactly? What were these discoveries Madeline and Sylvia made together? Something that made them afraid of the consequences. Although it's never explicitly said, the investigator seems to have quite a bit more pre-existing knowledge than he lets on about the contents of the books and about the powerful consequences of using whatever it was they found. In transcribing the books, what forbidden knowledge did they uncover? What was it that they unleashed? Was this the thing that led to Madeline's death? Or was Sylvia's distress not so much about what was unleashed, but rather what had to be done about it? In other words, what Sylvia had to do to stop it. Unfortunately, the investigator never makes this clear. Her facade finally broken, he once again asks his real question. Where are the books? But whether out of nervousness or caution, Sylvia still claims ignorance. It's then that the investigator becomes less subtle in his threats.
Miss Burke, you previously stated you didn't know where the books are presently. Yes, no, I don't know where they are. That is unfortunate. Perhaps if they were recovered, they would shed some light on the circumstances. Information like that could make quite a difference in how we evaluate your involvement and which parties need to be made aware.
In other words, give us the books or we're handing over what we know to less sympathetic parties, aka the police. Suddenly, Sylvia's memory returns and she promptly leaves the interview to retrieve them.
Looking back now, I think I might know where they are. You think you might? I know where they are.
End of tape. The investigator's final assessment is even more short and to the point than his interviews. Sylvia Burke was off the hook. Madeline's boyfriend was sentenced to life in prison, and the investigator seemingly got exactly what he came for. If knowledge is power, maybe it stands to reason that some knowledge is simply too dangerous. Perhaps there are hidden layers, hidden complex mechanisms to our reality that are best left in the shadows. But even still, there is one big mystery about all this that we haven't really dug into at all. Who exactly left these books in the Bookdrop in the first place? And why? Were Madeline and Sylvia chosen, or was there a reason that the books were intentionally discarded? The evidence certainly seems to suggest that Madeline unleashed something neither she nor Sylvia could understand. Maybe one of them performed a ritual of some kind, opening the door to something so powerful and malevolent it could only be deterred by another ritual, a more extreme ritual, and much, much more horrific. On the other hand, even if Sylvia was responsible for Madeline's death, maybe the simplest explanation is that it was all in their heads. That the mystery of these books perpetuated a tragic and bizarre shared hallucination. Personally, I'm not convinced that their fears were real, but clearly, they believed they were. Whatever their reasons and whatever was in those books, we may never know. However, it does seem like the investigator had a pretty good idea of what they contained. What we do know is that a series of books slipped into a book drop, sparking the curiosity of two librarians. A quest for knowledge from which only one would return. For Sylvia and for whoever sent the investigator, the stakes were too dire to ignore. And I have to admit, this gives me pause. But as far as I'm concerned, the only true victim is the one sitting in a prison cell. Among the survivors, that is. Before we conclude, there's one more thing I need to show you. Casually included in the investigator's final remarks is an unusual acronym. OI. From the context, he seems to be talking about the books that Sylvia handed over in the end, which begs the question, what does OI mean? To answer this, we should turn our attention to the final document of this case file. This document appears in many of the other case files I found in the archive. Much like a police incident report, this document involves an overview or summary of the case file from the perspective of the private investigator. It includes basic information, the who, where, and when, but it also includes fields designed for more unusual information. Unlike a normal incident report, the focus of this document is not on the crime, but on the source behind it. In other words, this document is made to summarize anomalies. The term OI appears in a few places, but there's one field that clues us in to its meaning. Object of interest. This section provides fields to describe the source of the anomaly in terms of what seems to generally be a physical object. Then at the very bottom, there are two signatures, an investigator and a client. I have so many questions, but until we unpack more of these case files, those questions will have to wait for another time. For me, this is all just one small piece of a much bigger puzzle. Who was this investigator? Who did they work for? And what were they after? This particular folder gave us some answers, but more than anything, I think it opened up a whole new world of questions. So, I'm going to keep making these videos because the other folders, they might offer a bit more. Thanks for watching.